Welcome to the Ladies Who Leverage podcast, where we empower women to own their power, create influence and impact, and live life unapologetically AF. It's time to leverage your expertise, resources, and relationships to build your business, brand, and badassery. So just click subscribe and let's get it. I'm your host, Kelly Charles Collins. Welcome to the Ladies Who Leverage podcast. Today I get to interview two guests. This is a first for the Ladies Who Leverage podcast, but I am so excited to interview these two women. So today we have Julie Erickson, who is a career coach who helps people find their right fit work. She wrote an ebook, Your Right Fit Job, Guide to Getting Work You Really Love, and has contributed essays to two other books, one of which is the best-selling Success from the Heart. She was executive director of two nonprofit organizations in New York City over a 12-year period, and prior to that, she led public-private workforce development initiatives in New York City government, which I'm sure was not an easy task. And she is a graduate of Smith College and has an MBA in leadership. So welcome, Julie. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. And we also have Dr. Suzanne Vosberg, who has worked as a researcher, writer, and photographer. Her PhD is in cognitive psychology. Now, this is really interesting. I loved reading about this. Suzanne's father owned and managed a medium-sized business. He emphasized how important it is to openly address conflict and respectfully acknowledge emotions for a company to be healthy. He thought this was an essential and often overlooked element in many companies. Now, in her work in various academic and industry environments, Suzanne has thought a lot about her father's perspective. And the book that she's co-authored with Julie, which is Betrayed by Work, Women's Stories of Trauma, Healing, and Hope After Being Fired, pursues her deeply held interest in how people work together. So ladies, welcome to Ladies Who Leverage podcast. How are you today?
Delighted to be here.
Hi.
It's interesting because I got an email and the email introduced you both and was, I was reading what your book was about and I was like, this is my story, right? Being fired. And it is the story of so many women out there in the world. And it's a story that I think needs to be told. And, as we talk about it, I'll share a little bit more with you about, how this impacted my life. But before we get there, I just, I've read your bios, but I want you all to just give a little bit more about, who you are, how you came into your respective spaces, because you're a career coach, Julie, Suzanne, you're a researcher, and how you two came together to write this amazing book that we're going to talk about today. Go ahead,
we got together about 7 years ago. 7 years ago to write the book. I was fired from one of my executive director jobs and then fired from another one. It wasn't that I hadn't done a good job. I realized that most of it's political. In the second one, it was personality problems. But when you're trying to get another job as an executive director of a nonprofit, being fired twice is not a good thing. So I tried and tried. Clearly, I wasn't going to succeed. And so I had to start my own business. And my business turned out to be this career coaching, executive coaching. I also do some organizational development. And what I found was that I was getting clients, particularly women, who had been fired, and they needed to talk about it. And so when I would tell them my story, they would be like, oh, like it started to heal something in them.
Yeah, because they thought they weren't alone. Right?
Exactly.
Right. And you're not the only one. Because you have those moments where you just like, oh my gosh, this happened to me. And in those moments, you think you're the only one. So Suzanne, I want you to jump in on that.
Well, that's what I'm just going to say. It's a perfect segue. And that's how I met Julie. I was one of those women. And what dawned on me when I was working with Julie is that she really it was very difficult to communicate how you and how you the raw you felt during that process. And after really just working with her for a long time, that's when the idea came up. And I remember calling her one day and saying, we should write a book about this. And Julie agreed. And it was either going to be an op-ed or a book. And to get to exactly what you're saying, Kelly, is because most women just don't understand what this is like. You have no idea until it's happened to you. You had no idea that it could happen to you. Like that just was not something that was on my radar. And how do you cope when your life has just been totally upended and you're traumatized?
Yeah.
And that was sort of how this came into being. Is we decided that at minimum, we can help some women. I mean, we were sort of chatting before, nobody's talked about this. I mean, I certainly, nobody ever told me about it. And we decided we just wanted to help and try to at least catalyze a conversation about this experience and that it's okay.
Yeah. And in the book, you actually tell stories of women, right, who have been through this, what could be a very traumatic experience, right, being fired, particularly since women really hold down a lot of the households and provide the income to households. So losing your job is not just losing your job, it's losing your ability to take care of your family. Did you always envision, so when you thought about the book, did you envision telling the stories of other women, or were you just thinking, we'll talk about what this was like from our own perspectives? How did it morph into that?
So I'll never dull. We always wanted to tell stories because, interestingly, what we discovered is once we started to tell one or two, we would tell like a person a story, and inevitably a woman would say, oh, I know somebody like that, or that happened to me, and this is what I did. And it wasn't like we went and said, okay, let's find a whole bunch of unhappy women, or let's find women who have an axe to grind. That is not the way that this book came into existence at all. It was just women started finding us, or then somebody would tell somebody else about that they knew that we were interested in this book. So these are all really interviews or women's stories and their voices of them telling their stories. It was very organic.
Yeah, I love that. And Julie, was it easy to get women to tell like the truth of their story? Because it's one thing to say, yeah, I'll tell you what happened. It's another thing to get them to really be vulnerable and tell the entire truth about what happened and how they were feeling and how it impacted them.
It was surprisingly easy. It felt like these women had just been waiting for someone to ask, and for someone to ask them who also had the experience, so that the shame of being fired was negated. It was okay. Like I'd been there, Suzanne had been there, and it seemed like it was a relief. In fact, one of our contributors, everybody's anonymous, by the way, in the book, because there still is shame and fear attached to it. But in the book, her name is Kayla. She said that telling her story was really the beginning of her road to healing from the trauma of being fired.
Yeah.
And I actually want to pop. Oops, sorry, Kelly, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to pop in because to also build on what Julie was saying, there was also another woman who basically said, I wanted to talk to you earlier, but I just couldn't. But then they were eventually able to come forward, and then everything, then they want to share.
Yeah. I think it's important that to have these conversations, because as I shared with you all, at the end of 2019, I was fired, right, from my job.
Yeah.
In October of 2019, I was fired from my job, and I was fired because they said they could no longer afford me, which I guess is not such a bad thing, right? That you've become so unaffordable. But, I thought about, for me that day, and I've written about this, I called it my freedom papers. I felt that I received my freedom papers on that day, and I was like, yes, now I'll just go do what I need to do. And I've written articles about it. And I think it's important, though, that we understand that not everybody feels that way, right? So not everybody feels like I felt in terms of, whew, this was a relief. Let me go do really what my purpose is calling me to do. So did you find what was the mix when you're talking about the women in the group in the book between those who this was a really traumatic experience for them and those who felt some measure of just relief?
I think that the majority of the women that we talked to found the actual experience of being fired really traumatic because it was done in a really cruel, we think inhumane way where all of a sudden you're gone. It's like 1 minute you have a job, the next minute you don't have a job. There were a couple of women who did sort of see it coming, and it was part of a layoff of a lot of different people. Those people had a little different experience. And me, I was fired twice. The first time was horrendous, really traumatizing. The second time, it was fine. Maybe because I'd been through it once, but also because they were kinder to me. And we found that people who had a better experience in being fired were able to recover more quickly. Now, Suzanne, why don't you jump in here and pick up on once people got through the experience of being fired, most people were able to pick up and find something that they loved doing.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Just one story comes to mind of one of our contributors who was downsized and knew that she was going to be downsized and was downsized with a bunch of people. And then she sort of really was able to launch forward and didn't experience the degree of trauma that everyone else did. But yeah, once people got through getting through the emotional reaction and then they were able to really think about what to do next and what they might enjoy doing next and how to leverage that experience.
Yeah. And I think that's the important part, right? About the leveraging. And I want to go back to what you were saying, Julie, about the being fired and the way, right? So, we've all been taught, well, I don't know, my mom used, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? And Maya Angelou says people forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget the way you made them feel, right? What was it? Was there a common denominator in the stories around the way in which these terminations happened that was really just inhumane or, traumatizing to some of the women?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I think the one thing that's common to all of them is that it happened really suddenly. And most people had no ability to talk to other people that they'd worked with, to say goodbye, to finish any projects. It was like all of us, some of people were walked out the door like they were common criminals. It was like all of a sudden you become nobody, you become invisible. And we did some research into brain science. And one of the things that we found among other needs that humans have is this need for connection. All of a sudden, you're not connected to other people. People stop returning your phone calls, stop people, because they're afraid that they can't be in touch with you for fear of being punished by the employer. And we think at-will employment is at the root of this. And we're really on a campaign to stop at-will employment.
So I'll say, I mentioned this to you that I was an employment lawyer, right, for 20 something years. And so, on the opposite end of it, and I understand the humanity part of it because I've always encouraged my clients to make sure that they do things in a humane way. And if you have people who are still in corporate or other employment lawyers listening, there are times when you do have to walk people out the door, right? There are times when you do have to just cut it off because of whatever the person is being released for and terminated for. But there is also the humane, right, humanity that needs to come through in that separation. So I understand what you're saying, and I understand, people don't like at will employment states and all of that that kind of stuff. But when we're talking about, separation, and we're talking separation from employment, and we're talking about the way in which it's done, one of the things that I found is that if it's done in the right way, though you still never want to be fired, it is an easier transition for you to move forward, right? But
Yes.
if you're in a space where all of a sudden it's just like you're out the door, right? And you
Right.
don't see it coming, then that really has a greater impact. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah, no, I want to just absolutely build on what you're saying, which is we're not saying jobs are never going to come to an end or that no one will ever get let go. It's just the how is what's really important.
Yeah.
That's all.
And my, from reading all of the stuff about your book, I don't want people to think like, listen, they're just putting this book out there so that people can talk about the fact that, they were terminated and quote unquote complain, bitch, moan, whine, right? There was a real reason that you all decided to put this book together. What was that? What were you intending, and what was the objective of putting this book together and putting these stories out there?
Suzanne,
you want me to start with
that?
Yes,
start, because she feels so strongly about this.
I know. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, and sorry, I apologize if I get excited and then I interrupt. I think it was just no one was talking about it. No one was talking about it, and we really felt a need to catalyze a conversation about what could be done to change how this process happens. That was really the impetus, and to help women.
We also felt really strongly about helping other women. In my coaching practice, I've talked to men and women who've been fired. And there really has been a big difference in how they processed it. Men they appreciate very much being told, wow, that's awful. I'm so sorry you got fired. And then they want to move on. Whereas women are like, oh my God, thank you so much. And they want to talk about it. And feelings as they come up need to be processed. People come to a different stage. There's anger, there's grief, there's all kinds of feelings that come up. It's very emotional, it's about identity. Who am I now? What do I do next? And we felt like women with each other heal each other. And we were writing this right around the time that Me Too was coming out. And so that was an inspiration for us as well. Like, take this out of the shame category, bring it in the open.
Yeah. Yeah. I was saying to you that before, that, I had to really think about whether or not I would say that I got fired. And I just got to the point where I was just like, I got fired. Like, it's not the end of the world. It has nothing to do with me, right? As a person, that's a decision that they made. And I think that's something important for us to get across to listeners and women who might be going through this, that it is not a reflection of you as a human being. And I used to always tell people, being a lawyer is what I did for a living. It's not who I was as a person. And so when I lost my job, I didn't lose myself, right? I didn't lose my soul. And so I think that that's also a really important conversation to have. And like you said, Julie, take away the shame associated with the word fired, right? Because there's such a negative connotation to that, as if you are less than, you did something wrong, you're a horrible person. Go ahead, Suzanne. I saw you wanted to jump in.
No, I was just saying, yep.
Well, actually, though, what's interesting is when we had started writing the book and we showed the proposal around, and then we had some stories and we showed them to people because we wanted feedback. One of the questions that would come up, well, what did they do? What did they do to get fired? It's like, they did nothing. In some cases, they were really good at their jobs. We also we include in the book stories from a number of women of color. Mm-hmm. And there was a racist aspect to some of these firings, The the stories speak for themselves. I can't really speak to it, but one woman who was South Asian, brown-skinned, the only one of a rash of people who were let go. Everybody else was retained, and they were all white. So there are a lot of different permutations of what happens. And when someone can identify that it was because of their problem, that too is healing. But until you get to that point, by talking about it, you carry that shame with you. What did I do? What was wrong with me?
Yeah.
And that is trauma. I mean, and all of this creates a level of trauma in the workplace and in the workforce that is another thing that is under identified and under accounted for in terms of people's work experience.
Yeah. And we take that with us, right? So when we're terminated or separated from one place, if we don't process through it, then we take that into the next place, which may end up causing us to get fired at that place, right? Just depending on, truthfully, right? Depending on how that ends up showing up. In the book, though, were there any women who said, well, yeah, I could see why they would have terminated me. Maybe my performance wasn't up to par or anything like that. Did anyone have that realization in processing this information?
Not a single one. They were either too expensive or too good at their jobs that they threatened their bosses, or there was a financial decision made to get rid of a bunch of people, or personality conflicts, honestly.
Yeah.
I don't think there was one person, Suzanne, whose performance merited them being fired.
And was that go ahead, Suzanne.
No, I was just going to say, I think it was also, I think, what did anybody reflect? And I don't think, I think some people said I could have done some things differently, but I don't think, yes, I agree that nobody said, oh, I realized I goofed up this event, or boy, I didn't do a good job on this client, with this client or something like that. Women were mostly left wondering what the heck just happened.
Yeah. And for those who may say, well, you just went and found all these women who, you're not telling both sides of the story. Was that a conscious effort on your part to really tell the stories from the trauma for people who really had no idea that this was coming to them, or kind of had an idea, but it wasn't really them that caused the firing, as opposed to women who had been fired and maybe, their performance or maybe something did impact the decision to fire them?
We didn't purposely seek out anybody. We got referred to people. Some people were clients.
People found us.
Yeah, people found us. Some people were my clients, but people found us. And I've posted on Facebook on my college's page, and they're coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
I
asked that question because I could see people asking, well, you're just telling one side of the story. And I think either way, firing is, or termination is, it's a disruption, right? At the very least, it's a disruption, whether, something that you did, said, way you acted caused your termination, or it was something that was totally outside of your control. And I think in either case, however, the way in which it is done, unless it's something that you just something crazy is going on and that person has to go and you have no time to process, I think in either situation, we can still be humane about the way in which we separate people from organizations. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that is our point. I mean, that's one of our main points, is the reason is moot in many ways. It's what happens and how it's handled that is of the critical piece. And it's not only for the people who are let go, but this is also for the people who are left behind. Because there's when you see somebody walk down the hall, or all of a sudden they're no longer there, it's traumatizing for you as a person who's left behind as well. So that is our main message. Yeah. One of our main messages. So I'm going to mute out because there's track practice departures going on here. I'm sorry. It's loud. Go ahead, Julie.
And so, that's important because even when I was fired in 2019, there was no like telling of anyone in the office. I told them because I was like, it is what it is, right? One day I'm not gonna be here, and you're like, where is she, right? And so I think that that's part of it too. But I also understand as an employment lawyer, sharing personnel decisions is not something that you're supposed to do. So there's a delicate balance in how you are, how you communicate the fact that someone's no longer there. But again, going back to being humane. And I know one of the things that you wanted to do with the book is not just to tell these women's stories, but to also help women with practical tools that they can use if they find themselves in a similar situation. So can you share like maybe one or two of those tools? I don't want to give away the whole book, but you can talk about why that was important to do that.
One of the things that was really important to us was to give practical takeaways on a couple of different levels. One level was on the you're not alone, sort of on the emotional level. You are going to recover. We don't know how, we don't know when. We list a whole bunch of things that people say, stupid things that people say, and you don't have to buy into that. It's okay. When they say it's not personal, yeah, it is. It's affecting me and my livelihood. Of course, it's personal. So go where it's warm, be with people who are willing to listen to you, find your tribe, find your peeps. Yeah. But then there's also the practical level. If you think you've been discriminated against, make sure that you go to the EEOC in your town. Practical things like make sure you have your own telephone so it's not turned off by your employer. Mine was turned off. I was fired and I had no one to call. What? So it's on that kind of, there's a little bit of legal, we're not lawyers, a little bit of really practical and a lot of emotional.
Yeah, I think the all of those things are important because when something like that happens, if it's really just out of the blue, you have no idea what to do next. So to be able to have just those kind of, here's some steps that you can take to even just get you grounded in the moment so that you can take a deep breath and move forward. I love that you're doing that. It's one of the things that I always make sure as I train, as a professional speaker and trainer, is to give people practical steps. What can you do? Because it's one thing to raise the awareness, right? So the stories raise the awareness for people who have never had this happen to them, or for other people who it's happened to kind of let them know that they're not alone. But then what, right? Great, you told me your story or told my story, then what do I do going forward? So I love that. Suzanne, did you want to jump in on that part of it too, about the takeaways?
No, I was just looking at them too, which is, we sort of say it's another way to think about conducting yourself at work, which is also, if you have a great email, that somebody sent you a great email about your work, about a project that you did with no company information, but just a great email, forward it to yourself at home. So you have a record of your work experience and your competency, because that is also something that you can look back on and say, I am competent. I did do this work, and nobody can take that away from you. But just that it's another way that that you can also just keep a record of yourself too, for yourself.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so glad that you all did the book. I think it's so important. I know that when I wrote about my story, that people were like, "Oh, thank you," right, for sharing, because we see people who are quote unquote successful, or who we believe to be in whatever state of our lives, and when you think, oh, well, they've never been fired, or they've never had this happen to them. And so when you can share those things, then, it really does open the world for other people to understand that it is not about them as people, right? Things happen and we have to move forward. So that's the other thing that we can't. One of the things I always talk about is sit, don't stay, right? So sit to
Right.
acknowledge what has happened,
That's cool.
right? Either the good or the bad, but you got to move, right? You can't stay there. You have to move. There has to be some forward progress. And I want to ask you, because you all had mentioned this before we began, you said that you got some resistance around this book and maybe still are experiencing some resistance around this book. Why do you think that is?
Tons of rejection, tons and tons of rejection.
We think it's because
Yeah.
people didn't have the experience and they didn't really understand how important it was, what a taboo subject it is.
Yeah, it's a stigma. Yeah.
Yeah, and how much we found, anyway, women really needed to talk about it. And so we finally were taken on by a publisher that got it, that wanted to start a conversation about how firing is done. I mean, we're the lowest ranked developed nation in terms of how workers are treated by the OECD.
What's the OECD?
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's like a UN organization, and we're all the way at the bottom. And what we did some research, and the New York Times 1619 project about the 400 years of slavery and then Jim Crow and everything else traces the at-will employment back to slavery. And so it's uniquely American. And we think, just like everything else to do with slavery, it should be done away with.
Well, I thank you for that. And I thank you all for writing the book. I really thank you for telling women's stories. It's important for us to amplify each other's voices, really to empower women to stand in their power, which, understanding that being fired is not the end of the world. It's the end of a job, right? It's the end. Sometimes you're not supposed to be in those spaces. I think that everything happens for a reason. And so, really taking the time to just process what it is and for what it is, right? So that you can move forward and just be a badass, right?
And open new worlds. I mean, I like your phrase, open new worlds, Kelly. I think that's a great way to think about it. And if you haven't had that experience, you might not realize that there are new worlds out there. There's tons of them. And sometimes we just get pushed into them. We didn't know that they were there, but they're there.
Sometimes you get pushed. Sometimes you walk into that space, but wherever it is, to just really own your power and know that it's not about you as a person. It's not a reflection of you as a person. So, ladies, I would love for you all to let everyone know how they can get your book and how they can contact you if they wanted to connect with you.
The book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Bookshop, which is for independent bookstores. It's called Betrayed by Work: Women's Stories of Trauma, Healing, and Hope After Being Fired. And I have a website called myrightfitjob.com, and people can reach me through that.
And you're Julie.
I'm Julie. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Suzanne, and I'm at SuzanneVosberg.com, and it's or SV@SuzanneVosberg.com.
Thank you, ladies, so much. I'm so glad that we had a chance to have this conversation. This is a really important topic and a stigma that we need to get rid of, right? And just embrace who we are as women, as badass women. So thank you all for being on the show with me today. And
thanks for having us.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
You too. And I'd like to just invite you, if you are a female entrepreneur, a side hustler, or a woman in career transition, not really sure if you want to be an entrepreneur or you want to go back to those people's job, and you are ready to take action to live life unapologetically AF, I'd love to invite you to join our community, Ladies Who Leverage. We are a global community of women, and we empower you to leverage your expertise, resources, and relationships to build your business, your brand, and your badassery. So you can join us by going to teamlwl.com. So that's TEAM as in Mary, LWL.com to join our amazing community. And remember to subscribe to the Ladies Who Leverage podcast. Our episodes drop every Monday at 9 a.m. You never want to miss an episode. So for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by Lady Lawyer Media. If you're a badass woman who's ready to take action to live life unapologetically AF, then you need to join our global community on Facebook, Ladies Who Leverage. And remember to subscribe to our podcast. And until next time, let's collabosource, strategize, and monetize.